So I'm going to introduce our guest. Some of you may know Codie, some of our guests know Codie. So Codie is a 214 graduate of Gettysburg University, where he earned a bachelor's degree in communication journalism and held a minor in history. Currently serves as visitor services coordinator at the Gettysburg Seminary Ridge Museum, where for the past 5 years he has delivered battlefield tours on the campus of the Lutheran Seminary, particularly from its famous cupola. He has lectured for historical societies, Civil War roundtables, and educational groups, and has written for several publications, including local newspapers, regional magazines, and national history journals. He maintains the Facebook page Codie Eash, writer and historian, and the history blog Ramblings from the Ridges. Joining Codie tonight is Andy Bingaman, I should have asked you, who is a living historian from the East Berlin area, who portrays a soldier of the 2nd Maryland Infantry, which is part of Codie's topic this evening. So Codie's going to talk to us about Middle Room for Rebels. You'll probably find this is very current eventsy, even though it's a long time ago. So Codie, welcome.
Thank you. Well, thank you everybody for being here. I apologize, I'm going to be on the side of the room here. My technology limitations are going to prevent me from being at the front, but this is a very visual...
technology limitations.
But basically, it is a very visual presentation. So there's going to be a lot of images in front of you, a lot of photographs, historic images of this site on Culp Hill, of the Gettysburg area in general. A lot of maps will be involved here, and so I'll kind of keep what's in front of you moving to allow you to have a nice visual. And so basically our topic for this evening is going to be Gettysburg's first Confederate Monument, a very timely topic. For the most part, our national debate over the past couple of years has focused primarily on those monuments which are in courthouse lawns or town squares, not so much battlefield monuments. But it is kind of interesting for that reason that the first debates over monuments are those which are on battlefields. And the topic we're going to be talking about this evening is that to the 2nd Maryland Infantry. This is a regiment otherwise known as the First Maryland Battalion. And I apologize right now, I'm going to be going back and forth between those two for no rhyme or reason. We'll talk about why they changed names, but if I refer to the 1st Maryland or the 2nd Maryland, not to confuse everyone, I'm talking about the exact same regiment. But these folks will dedicate a monument on the Gettysburg battlefield 23 years after the battle in 1886. Up until that point, it had been disallowed for Confederate veterans to dedicate memorials on the Gettysburg battlefield, in part because it's seen as a Union Veterans Memorial Park, in part as well simply because Confederate veterans didn't have much of an interest in doing so. It's the site of arguably their greatest defeat. They also didn't have a whole lot of money to dedicate monuments up until that time. And so if veterans organizations had an opportunity to dedicate a memorial or a marker on a battlefield, it was more than likely going to be placed on a southern battlefield, that is places like Chickamauga in Georgia or Shiloh in Tennessee. But by 1886 in Gettysburg, there will be this first Confederate monument. And as we'll see throughout the course of our evening here, over the coming years, it's going to be seen as more and more controversial as it picks up steam across the nation, as folks start to realize exactly what a Confederate monument on what is seen as a Union Memorial Park will exactly mean. Now, in terms of our modern debates over this, these are certainly images that we've seen on our newspapers, and if you watch the news or scroll across your Facebook. Things like vandalism to Confederate monuments, things like covering up Confederate monuments, or ultimately their removal, most famously in New Orleans with the Robert E. Lee statue there. If we establish anything this evening, I hope it's that you walk away knowing that this is nothing new, that though it might feel like these debates are something that this is the first time we're having them, this is the first time people are calling for the removal of these memorials, these are events that have very similar stories as we go throughout history. And so if we begin with a little anecdote here, this is a story of a man whose name is George Matthews. He is from New York, and he's traveling around the Gettysburg battlefield one day with a friend of his. And as they're visiting Gettysburg, they walk up Culp Hill, they see the 2nd Maryland Monument, and he sees that there's paint spread across it. And he asks that maybe this be cleaned up. He wonders who did this. And this is certainly something that looks a lot like the image on the left-hand side there. People spraying graffiti or paint onto a statue there, in that case of Jefferson Davis. But in fact, this was in February 1891. This is just a couple of decades after the Civil War, just 5 years after this monument to the 2nd Maryland had been dedicated. Mr. Matthews would say that he was in company with some Union soldiers, and we visited Culp Hill, where at that time the only Confederate monument was erected. Someone with more hatred than love in his bosom besmeared the Confederate stone. One of my friends and a Union man who fought there said, "Such a shame. If it were possible, I would wash it off. Such is the influence of a quarter of a century, at least, some who fought their mistaken brothers. And this just shows us that vandalism is certainly nothing new, that even in 1891, folks at Gettysburg are dealing with these very issues which we do today. Now let's take a step back and talk a bit about who the men were who we're going to be talking about this evening. And what I want to accomplish this evening, if we break it kind of into a traditional who, what, when, where, why, and how, is who were the men of the 2nd Maryland or 1st Maryland? What was the reaction to the erection of their monument? Where on the Gettysburg battlefield was this placed, and why do they feel that was an important location? When was the monument dedicated? What's substantial about its date? When did it gain notoriety? Why was the existence of the Confederate Monument seen as so significant to so many people? And how does this story serve as an introduction to our modern controversy? So we have a lot of ground to cover, but let's begin with the folks who this is dedicated to. Now the Marylanders are going to be in a precarious position. Maryland is one of those so-called border states at the beginning of the Civil War. States where slavery is legal, but they don't secede from the Union. There is a large secessionist movement within the state of Maryland. It is eventually quelled. In fact, some of the secessionist meetings are going to actually be, those folks are going to be arrested in Frederick, Maryland in 1861. And so Marylanders who want to fight for the Confederacy have a choice to make. They can either kind of exile themselves from their own state by joining Confederate Army, even though they're not officially part of the Confederacy, the state that is, where they can go across the river into Maryland, or into Virginia. And that's what a lot of these individuals will do. But eventually this man, Arnold Elzey, on the right-hand side you see pictured here, is going to establish a Maryland infantry, the 1st Maryland. One of the things he has to do, though, is come up with this sort of strange enlistment period. Anybody who's familiar with the Civil War, you may know that usually if you're a Confederate soldier and you're enlisting in the Confederate Army, you're enlisting for the course of the war. He can't get that through the Maryland legislature, though, because they don't exactly know what Maryland's place is in all this. And so they're going to sign a 1-year enlistment. And during that year, these men will see some of the bloodiest combat of the first year of the Civil War. They'll be at the very confusing battle of First Manassas, or First Bull Run, just outside of Washington in July of 1861. They'll fight with Stonewall Jackson throughout the Shenandoah Valley. But by the end of that year, by the summer of 1862, when these men are going to be ending their enlistment, once more, they're in this sort of precarious situation. They had signed a 1-year enlistment with their state, but if you were a Confederate soldier, you had to serve for the duration of the war. And so there is sort of going to be this mutiny of sorts. And actually, one of the regimental commanders, Bradley Johnson, who will pop up a few times throughout our evening, he's very disappointed that so many of his men put up a fight about fighting beyond that 1-year enlistment. And he basically abandons the regiment. He says, I've never fought with a more cowardly bunch of individuals. But these men will end their enlistment in August of 1862. Many of them do choose, however, to re-enlist into another regiment. It's going to be the 2nd Maryland. So the 2nd Maryland is not going to achieve that title quite yet. They're going to be initially called the First Maryland Battalion. One of the other weird things about this regiment, that 1-year enlistment, when it's over, that regiment was seen as not existing anymore. So they had to come up with a new numerical identification. And the 1st Maryland had already been used, but there weren't enough men to be considered a regiment. So they're going to be giving the name the 1st Maryland Battalion. Another interesting thing about these men is that at the bottom right, of course, we have the Confederate battle flag. They choose not to use that flag, and they're actually not given one until after the Battle of Gettysburg. So as we look at some of the artistic depictions here in a little bit of what they did at Gettysburg, you'll see just the 2 flags at the bottom left and top right. Top right will be the first national Confederate flag. Bottom left there will be, at that time, the Maryland state flag. Of course, the state flag in Maryland has changed somewhat. If you look at the center of the then Maryland flag, you'll see that is the modern Maryland flag, the more familiar yellow, black, and red there. Now, these men are going to come from the areas right around, if you see Washington, the center of the map there, District of Columbia, they're going to come right around that area of the state of Maryland. Now, the significance of this map is that this is the 1860 slave population map. The darker the county, the higher the population of slaves. And so this section of Maryland where these men are from is predominantly the southern-leaning side of Maryland, with that predominantly the slave-holding section of Maryland. Now it's interesting to note as well, and this will come back up in a little bit when we're talking about Gettysburg, of the Union regiments that come out of the state of Maryland, interestingly, many of them came from the same location. And when emancipation becomes an official war in 1863, many of those men refused to fight. And so similar ideologies to the men who were fighting on opposite sides. It's just that those Marylanders who saw fit to fight for the Confederacy, of course, they're going to join up in Southern armies. Now, by the summer of 1863, these men haven't seen a whole lot of combat other than that first year, when they were known as the First Maryland Infantry. On the left-hand side, we have the 4 individuals who are going to command this regiment at the Battle of Gettysburg. Over the next several minutes, I'll read for you multiple accounts here from the man who is at the top right of those individuals. That's Major William Worthington Goldsborough. And he writes what is arguably the most extensive account on behalf of these Marylanders and what exactly they did at the Battle of Gettysburg. So they're coming out of the Shenandoah Valley from winter encampment in 1862, 1863. Shenandoah Valley would be just off the bottom of the map there. They're eventually going to cross the Mason-Dixon line on June 18, 1863. This is right after fighting at the Second Battle of Winchester, Virginia, in the midst of the valley. And Goldsborough says that as they advance into Pennsylvania, they experience a range of emotions. One of them is the joy, which beyond baffled description upon reaching the Maryland shore. These men are back in their home state, passing through it on the way to Pennsylvania. But then he says that there's sorrow when they pass through the town of Sharpsburg and halt upon the famous battlefield of Antietam. At the bottom of the map you see Sharpsburg. Today's the 156th anniversary of that battle. Happy Constitution Day as well. Today's the anniversary of the ratification of the Constitution. Now eventually they're going to move through Hagerstown, Maryland. He says they're heartily received, but as they continue to move across the Mason-Dixon line into places like Greencastle and Mercersburg into Pennsylvania, he says that they're going to be subject to the scowling fiercely upon us, and no doubt many of those individuals wished every rebel son of us were the devil. On June 23rd is when they're going to cross into Pennsylvania, and they're going to make that kind of awkward westward movement rather than taking a straight line. That's in part because most of Robert E. Lee's army is concentrated around Chambersburg, so there's kind of a traffic jam there. The other reason that they're going to move in that westward direction is to capture several thousand livestock in that general area as well. They're eventually going to move up toward Carlisle, and then on June 30th, they're going to start backtracking. As Lee is starting to concentrate his army, Union forces are now gathering at Gettysburg. He says, Goldsborough, that is, that as they backtrack, they thought they were going back into Maryland without a fight. And many of the men are actually disappointed in that. But eventually he says, we came to the conclusion we were about to move on Baltimore and Washington. Now, he was from north central Maryland. He had spent quite a bit of time here in south central Pennsylvania. And he says that in my youth, I had more than once traveled almost every road in York, Adams, and Franklin counties and was familiar with them all. And so he's sort of leading his men as they're making this eastward movement eventually toward Gettysburg. Now, on the morning of July 1st, 1863, on the western side of town, the leftmost red line you see are going to be the first Confederates on the field. The leftmost blue line is the Union cavalry. As the battle opens at about 7 a.m., the Marylanders are not going to be on the field. They're going to miss the entirety of the first day. By the time they get to Gettysburg, Union forces have been pushed through town. The bottom of the map there, you can see the upside-down U. That's the beginning of that famous fish hook. Where the barb of the hook rests will be Culp's Hill, at basically the top left of where that curvature is there, that Cemetery Hill, and goes down off the map, Cemetery Ridge, and eventually to the Round Tops a couple of miles south. Goldsborough says that as they're entering the town of Gettysburg, they were told to press forward with all dispatch. And eventually, as they're approaching the town, they see several thousand federal prisoners and the unmistakable testimony of a stubbornly contested battle. The ground was covered with the dead, blue and gray, side by side. Slaughter was appalling. The dead lay literally in heaps. Nightfall is approaching by the time that these men actually arrive on the battlefield, and so they won't see any action. But they will be pushed through the town of Gettysburg toward the east side of town. Now, Robert E. Lee's battle plan for the next day is basically going to be such that on the left end of the Union line, off the map to the south there, places like Little Round Top, Devil's Den, Wheatfield, Peach Orchard, there'll be an attack there, and simultaneously there's going to be an attack on the Union right flank at Culp's Hill. And so the Marylanders will move into position that afternoon. They're going to ford Rock Creek, and you can see a period photo of it at the top right-hand side. Now, one interesting thing happens that day. As these men are moving toward their position, Goldsborough is going to see an old friend of his, and it's Gettysburg newspaper editor, Henry Stahl. He's the editor of the Compilers, the conservative paper in town, which would have been the Democratic paper at that time. And he starts talking to Goldsborough, and he says that a town of gaping citizens surrounded us and imagined Mr. Stahl was hatching treason, and forthwith reported him to the authorities. And he's actually going to be arrested, taken to Baltimore, and he'll spend a couple of months at Fort McHenry as a prisoner there. Now, in the process, Goldsborough tells us a little bit about why he likes Henry Stahl. And this is sort of telling for eventually the folks who are going to dedicate this monument of sorts. Goldsborough says that he felt that Stahl was the most manly and independent individual in the town of Gettysburg, which is telling because a couple of years later, Stahl is going to talk about, in his paper openly, the insidious Negroites that are the Republican Party. He becomes an ardent white supremacist in the Gettysburg community. He disparages the Republican Party as belonging to the Negro Equality Party, and he encouraged all conservative men to see to it that Republican plans for Negro equality be foiled as they sought to educate the masses to accept political and social equality. The Negro is not the white man's equal, and no attempt to force him upon the white man can ever be successful. These are the individuals who Goldsboro is talking to in the town of Gettysburg. People think that he's hatching treason, and they're going to arrest Stahl in the process. Now, eventually that evening, the Confederate forces of Maryland Stewart's Brigade, that's the brigade that these men belong to, they're going to move up the slopes of Culp Hill to attack a really well-entrenched Union position. He says, we crossed the uneven ground, which was covered with immense rocks, and crossed waist-deep Rock Creek, where a sharp fight ensued. Dusk was approaching, which left me to reflect we were rapidly approaching Culp Hill through one of the densest woods I ever passed. In an instant, the heavens were lighted up by the flash of thousands of muskets, and the deadly Minnie-balls tear and rend our ranks fearfully. The column reveled and staggered like a drunken man. Throughout the night, he says, enemy as well as friendly fire combined to cause the men of my battalion to fall like autumn leaves. After a period of standing and fighting it out, orders were given to charge the breastworks, even if I lost every man in the regiment. This was followed by a destructive, enfilading fire upon the enemy, who still remained in the breastworks, which compelled them to fall back to the upper portion of Culp Hill. They bend the Union line back. It's the most successful any Confederate forces have been that day. Now, they'll encamp just a couple yards from the Union line, basically, that night. And the next morning, they're going to move forward a little bit, try to seize their advantage, get some of the roads there at the southern end of Culp Hill. Now, as the early morning of July 3rd approaches, Goldsboro says that at dawn, the whole hillside once more enveloped in blaze. Trees were riddled, and balls could be heard to strike the breastworks like hailstones upon rooftops. The fire was returned as best we could, but it was almost certain death to expose